Ne të krishterët besojmë që Jezusi është Zot. Në të njëjtën kohë themi se ai është Biri i Perëndisë. Kur i pohojmë të dyja këto të vërteta, disa pyesin: "Po prit, a është Jezusi Perëndi apo Biri i tij?" Disa të tjerë pyesin se pse ekzistojnë 4 ugji për jetën e Jezusit dhe jo vetëm një. Mbase ti ose dikush që ti njeh është interesuar të di rreth këtyre temave. Unë kam patur kënaqësinë të diskutoj këto pyetje dhe disa të tjera me një teolog dhe studiues të Biblës, Dr. Trent Hyatt. Dr. Hyatt ka një master në teologji nga Seminari Teologjik i Dallasit në Texas të Shtetet Bashkuara të Amerikës. Ai ka gjithashtu një doktoratur në teologji nga Universiteti i Bazelit në Zvicër. Në vitin 1967, Dr. Hyatt ju bashkua organizatës misionare Instituti Jetare, e njohur ndërkombëtarisht si CRU, dhe pasi shërbeu për 7 vitet e para në Amerikë dhe në Angli, në vitin 1974 ai ndihmoi në hapjen e shërbesës në Evropën Lindore. Ai ishte drejtuesi i kësaj shërbese në Gjermaninë Lindore nga viti 1975 deri në vitin 91. Pas rënies së komunizmit, Dr. Hyatt themeloi dhe drejtoi Institutin për Studime Biblike dhe Teologjike, rol të cilin ai e mbajti deri në vitin 2012. Përmes kësaj iniciative, ai ka vizituar shumë shpesh edhe Shqipërinë duke mësuar të krishterët shqiptar në çështjet teologjike dhe biblike. Pikërisht në njërin prej këtyre vizitave në Shqipëri, unë pata privilegjin të drejtoj Dr. Hyatt pyetjet që përmenda më sipër. Ndiqni tani përgjigjet që Dr. Hyatt jep për secilën prej këtyre pyetjeve.
This question is a little bit like the question, are you a man or the son of a man? I'm both, of course. But there is a widespread misunderstanding about the meaning of the term Son of God. The term Son of God, as it applies to Jesus, has nothing to do with physical descent, as if God the Father had relations with some being and Jesus was the offspring. Not the case at all. The term Son of God is a term of respect and honor, of a high standing. And in fact, the term applies to Jesus before his physical birth on earth. He was already the Son. In fact, he is the eternal Son that has existed forever. Now, the term Son of God, interestingly, can apply to human beings. I regard myself as a son of God. But I became a son of God through placing my faith in Jesus. And so that my status as a son of God, is quite different than the status that Jesus has as the unique Son of God. This becomes really clear in one of the statements that Jesus made that's recorded for us in the 17th chapter of the Gospel of John. It's in a prayer. And in verse 5, he says the following, "Now, Father, glorify me together with yourself with the glory which I had with you before the world was." So this is very clearly a claim to an eternal existence, that he had this glory with the Father before the creation. So this takes us back to a time before time. Yes, there is, in fact, also in John's Gospel, in the 8th chapter, Jesus is in one of his many interactions, debates with the Jews. And Jesus makes the statement in John 8, verse 58, "Truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." This is quite an interesting, intriguing statement. Grammatically, it would almost seem to be a syntactical mistake to say something like that. But he says it like that to emphasize his eternal or pre-existence. So he didn't say before Abraham was, I was. He says before Abraham was, I am, which reflects the name for God in the Old Testament, Yahweh. Yahweh is related to the Hebrew word for to be, I am. So when Jesus says before Abraham was, I am, he is underlining his eternal existence as the God revealed in the Old Testament, Yahweh. Now, even that is not the only place by any means where Jesus expressed this very lofty claim to be God. In John 10, verse 30, in an interaction with the Jews, he said, I and the Father are one, expressing a unity with the Father that the Jews immediately understood. And you know how they reacted? They bent over and picked up stones to stone him to death. And Jesus asked, "For what good work that I have done are you stoning me?" And their response was, "Not for a good work do we stone you, but for blasphemy, because you make yourself out to be equal with God, and you're just a man." So in other words, the Jews understood him very well as to what he was claiming. And they understood him exactly as we Christians understand him. He was making a claim to deity. The difference, of course, is they rejected his claim. They denied it, and we as Christians accept it, that Jesus gives plenty of reason to accept his truthfulness in declaring who he is. Therefore, the answer to the question of Jesus, is Jesus the Son of God or God? The answer is yes, both. This is an interesting question, and a question that you really can't answer without going back first and focusing on the fact that the deity of Jesus is a central pillar of Christianity. Without the deity of Christ, you really don't have Christianity. So how can such a stupendous claim to deity be justified? Wouldn't Christianity be better off with just an ethical system instead of a belief in a divine man on earth? A lot of people have thought that, but as you look at the evidence, you find that Jesus made the claims himself to deity, claims that really can't be interpreted any other way than a claim to a divine personhood. Consequently, we are forced into a position of recognizing that he's telling us the truth, in which case he is God, or he's lying to us, which completely destroys his credibility, or he was mentally imbalanced, a psychological imbalanced person. The last two options, a psychological imbalance or a liar, just aren't plausible when you look at all of the evidence of the kind of person Jesus was, which forces us back onto the conclusion he was telling us the truth. Now, of course, we freely admit as Christians that this is a mystery. The idea that someone could be at one and the same time truly man and truly God defies logic. It isn't something that can be explained logically. Now, it is true that there is at least an analogy in the physical world. Light, for example, is said by the physicists to demonstrate the properties of both particles and waves, both at the same time. So this is referred to as a duality by the physicists, so that at least an analogy is there for how something can, at one and the same time, be two different things. And I think this is a reasonable comparison to the deity and humanity of Jesus at one and the same time. It isn't explicable logically. It is a mystery. We completely affirm that. But it is a mystery that is true. That's a central issue. Why would God become man? Now, it's true there are prophecies in the Old Testament about a Messiah coming to reveal God to man, to perform a work of deliverance for Israel. But to find a reason why God would become man requires that we look not only at what God has done, but at what man needs. And the thing that we find when we really look at mankind is he's caught in sin and suffering. And it is for that reason that God became man, to redeem man from his plight, from his trapped position in sin and suffering. So if God would go to such extraordinary lengths as to become incarnate, to become man. What that really means is that the Creator entered into his own creation. A remarkable thought. But if he loved his creation, that provided the motivation for him to do that. And yet, to become man means he had to be, his deity had to be veiled. That is to say, to some degree, hidden. So that Jesus, as a man, became hungry, he became tired, he could be beaten, he could be killed. In all those things, he demonstrated humanity. And yet, he also demonstrated his deity in acts of power, in his goodness, and ultimately in his death on the cross and his resurrection, all affirmed that he was not just a man, but he was also God. Well, if this was something that God actually did in history, that is, becoming incarnate in the person Jesus of Nazareth, he veiled his deity, which means he voluntarily accepted many of the limitations of humanity. And that's what we see in his admission that only the Father knew the time of the end of the world. That was within the period of time in which he voluntarily accepted limitations on his deity. But that does not mean that he ceased being God. God can never cease to be God. If he's God, he will always be God. Now, this limitations on the expression of his deity were removed when he was resurrected from the dead. Jesus is just as, or is exactly as omniscient as the Father. Each member of the Godhead knows all things, including Jesus as the resurrected one, which is different than Jesus as the incarnate one on earth in space-time history. This is a question of great importance. The first thing we have to establish is, are those kinds of claims actually present in the Bible? And it is without any great difficulty provable that Jesus made those kinds of claims. Perhaps the most explicit expression of those claims comes in John 8 and John 10 and John 17. In those passages, Jesus claims to have existed from eternity. He says, before Abraham was, I am, which is a claim to an eternal existence, using the very words that are used as part of the name of God in the Old Testament, the name Yahweh, I am. And he prays in John 17 that the Father will restore him to the glory that he always had with the Father before the world existed. A very explicit claim to an eternal existence as God. But it's not all in the Gospel of John. We also find, for example, in Mark 2, that Jesus makes the startling statement to someone who is a paralyzed person on a stretcher, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And the Jews who were standing there were immediately offended, thinking, who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus then responded, so that you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, and then turns to the paralyzed man and heals him. He stands up and walks. So there's the healing, which is quite remarkable, but more than that, there is the claim to have the right to forgive sins on earth. Not long after this event, with the healing of the paralytic, after forgiving his sins, we find Jesus in a boat with his disciples making his way across the Sea of Galilee when a terrific storm comes upon them. The amazing thing is Jesus was asleep in the boat. And as the waves rose and the winds blew, the disciples became afraid the boat would capsize and they'd all drown. So they wake Jesus up. Don't you care? We're perishing. And Jesus' response was to stand up and to rebuke the storm, the wind and the waves, and immediately a great stillness came upon the sea. The response of the disciples was, "Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him?" Which, of course, is a recognition that there's divine power there. There is a passage as well in Matthew's Gospel in which Matthew records a prayer of Jesus which has remarkable similarities to the one we find in John 17. And in this prayer, Jesus prays, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him." This is a remarkable passage because Jesus claims not simply the authority of a prophet to speak for God, to reveal God, but he claims the authority to establish a relationship between a human and God, and says that God himself ordains this relationship between humans and himself. So this is a very strong claim to deity. But, you ask, are those sayings really authentic? Did Jesus actually say those things, or were those things added later, so to speak, put into his mouth? It's an extremely important fact that the proclamation, the teaching, the preaching of what we call the gospel, the good news about Jesus, began immediately after his crucifixion and resurrection. There wasn't a long period of time where things could kind of grow up into some kind of legend. There's way too little time for legend or myths to enter into this equation at all. In fact, the Gospels themselves were written in the lifetime of the people who were witnesses to Jesus. So any discrepancy between what Jesus actually said and did and what was written would have created a great disagreement, a great conflict. And that never came about because what was proclaimed by the apostles right after the death and resurrection of Jesus is the same thing that's written in the Gospels, in the New Testament. So we have both the closeness of the events to the proclamation of the events and the documentation of the events, all saying the same thing, affirming one another, so that there's really no reason, no plausible reason to say Jesus' claims weren't from his mouth, but from people much later. In fact, they came from him, and we have excellent evidence of that. Actually, the fact that we have 4 Gospels rather than just one increases our confidence in the story of the life of Jesus, his deeds, his words, and his resurrection. The fact that we have the perspective of 4 different authors who bring to expression things about the life of Jesus increases the vividness and the clarity of the detail we have about this historical person. Now, the message of Christ, the gospel, was being preached around the Mediterranean in the various cultures that were found there at the time, soon, very soon after his death and resurrection. And each of these gospels was being written to meet a need of a particular culture. For example, the gospel that most scholars think was the first gospel to be written, the Gospel of Mark, was written to the Romans. It is the recorded preaching of the Apostle Peter, so one of the inner circle of the 12 disciples of Jesus. It is not entirely certain which gospel was written first. Most scholars think that Mark was written first. However, some think it was Matthew. Mark was the preaching of the Apostle Peter, one of the 12 in the inner circle. The Gospel of Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew, one of the 12, and it was written to satisfy the need to know by the Jews how Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament about the coming of the Messiah. Some people even think that Matthew was first written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek. Though this is possible, it's far from certain. The third gospel, the Gospel of Luke, was written by a close associate and fellow worker of the Apostle Paul. Luke is especially interesting because he actually gives us a description of how he went about his historical research. Let me read for you the verses at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So you see, Luke emphasized the thoroughness of his research and the care he took in writing his gospel. However, very early in the 20th century, a famous archaeologist and historical scientist who was skeptical of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts launched an extensive study into Luke's writings to see how many mistakes or how erroneous much of his writing might be. But the results of his research forced him to acknowledge just the opposite. Let me read for you what this man by the name of Sir William Ramsay said about the Gospel of Luke. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historian's, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. In fact, Ramsay went on to say, Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. And Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. These conclusions were reached by a man who was actually a skeptic, who was not a Christian, and he did not believe in the historical reliability of Luke and his writing in the Gospel and the book of Acts. Yet his research forced him to just exactly the opposite conclusions, that Luke was in fact painstakingly careful and accurate in the picture that he gave of the history of Jesus and the apostles. Finally, the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, was written by one of the 12. In fact, John was in the inner circle of the three most significant disciples who were close to Jesus, Peter, James, and John. John wrote later than the other writers of Gospels did, but he wrote for a universal audience with a great deal that the other gospel writers hadn't included, which he knew by virtue of his closeness to Jesus, so that we have a greater insight into Jesus' teachings about himself and his relationship with God, the Father, than we get from any of the other three gospels. So does it undermine or weaken our confidence in the truthfulness of our information about Jesus, that we have four Gospels instead of one? Quite the contrary. The fact that we have four increases our confidence because these four writers complement one another, give details that each one don't include, but some of them do. They overlap at times, and consequently we have a fuller picture with more detail, and we have more confidence that the picture they paint for us, what we read in these Gospels, is an accurate picture of the greatest person ever to live in history. All the writings in the Bible, of course, were written by men. However, God does speak through men when he calls prophets to give his message. So the writings that we find in the Gospels are of this nature. They were the message of God to man through the immediate followers of Jesus, through the apostles and those who accompanied the apostles. This doesn't present any barriers to seeing these writings as having been inspired by God. Indeed, the fact that they each had a personal relationship with Christ, the historical Jesus, and wrote about him from their experience with him, lends greater confidence to us that what they wrote is an accurate picture of this man who was, in fact, God in human flesh, the greatest person to ever live. The 66 books of the Bible display a great deal of variety. They're not all the same genre. So, for example, we have books that are historical in nature, like Genesis, Exodus, the Gospels. But there are also books that are filled with what we might call law. They give guidance for the way worship should be performed and for the way people should behave. We have those kinds of writings in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We also have books that give instructions for the young believers. I'm thinking, of course, especially of the New Testament epistles, which were written to the first churches. But we also have books that deal with the future. We call them prophecy, such as the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation, telling us about what's going to happen in the future. In the 19th century, there was an overwhelming negative opinion about the reliability of the Bible. Scholars, especially in Germany, but later also just as much in England and then even in the USA, had the opinion that the Bible was quite inaccurate in the things that it asserted and quite unreliable in the things that it taught. However, many archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries were busy doing extensive research in Greece, Turkey, the Holy Land, and made many discoveries of an archaeological nature, as well as discovering many portions, fragments, manuscripts of the Scripture dating back to early centuries. One of the most active archaeologists of this era, the early 20th century, and in fact one of the most respected of modern archaeologists, was a man named Nelson Glueck. Nelson Glueck made some very remarkable statements about what his archaeology showed him as to the accuracy of the Bible. Let me read to you what he said. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries. This is a remarkable statement. What it clearly means is the overwhelming skepticism of scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries is actually unfounded, that the references in the Bible to historical events are actually accurate references to events that took place in history. Of course, the Bible is not just a historical narrative. It's also a prophetical book. It contains not just references to historical events, but to the interpretation of those events, what those events meant, and to prophecies having to do with future events. It also warns us of future events, of times when God will intervene in the flow of history. So the truthfulness of the Bible should not be seen just in terms of historical accuracy, but also in terms of its broader message, its claims to truth about God, Jesus Christ, the spiritual and moral nature of man, and what God requires of man. The historical reliability of the Bible, then, is more than just an attitude towards the historical record. It encourages us to take seriously its claims of truthfulness about ultimate issues, about the relationship of man to God and man's need for forgiveness from his sins. I think knowing the historical reliability of the Bible should actually motivate us to investigate its claims, to investigate the claims of Jesus Christ, who invites all people to come to him and become his followers. As to whether the Bible has been changed, by that I mean changed from what was originally written down by the authors of the Bible, we can be fairly confident that this was not the case. Of course, the entire Bible was written long before the invention of the printing press. This means that all the copies of the Bible, like all the books of antiquity, had to be hand copied. The work of a scribe, a person who engaged in the painstaking work of copying books onto papyrus or parchment, was actually an important activity throughout much of antiquity. Careful labor was required, and normally exacting tests were practiced to ensure that documents were copied correctly. Certainly, minor textual errors crept into texts, but these were relatively easy to detect and did not change the meaning or the substance of the works being copied. The Bible is actually a unique case in terms of the writings from antiquity. Whereas we have only a handful of manuscripts of ancient writings from authors like Homer or the classical authors of the Greek and Roman periods, we have thousands, literally tens of thousands of copies of fragments and portions of manuscripts of the biblical book. The wealth of manuscript copies from antiquity enables textual scholars to examine and compare the existing copies and to establish with a very high degree of certainty what the original text said. Thus, when you pick up a modern printed copy of the Bible, you hold in your hand a unique volume. It is a book that was written over a period of about 1,500 years by about 40 different authors in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. There are about 25,000 manuscripts, fragments, and parchments that we now have of the Bible. These display an amazing consistency which allows us to know with a great deal of confidence what the original text actually said. There's quite simply a mountain of evidence that what we have today in our Bibles is actually almost 99% or more certain exactly that which was written by the original authors. So, as to a change in the Bible from the time it was written to the copies we have now, there's absolutely no evidence for it. On the contrary, there's a great deal of evidence that we have very accurate copies.